Once we've finished our SewByNumber pillow tops, we can move on to completing our pillow covers. We're going to start by taking our 13.5 by 17.5 inch rectangles that we've cut for our backing, and we're going to press one of the long edges, wrong sides together, 1 inch. So we're going to fold that over and then press. We're going to fold it one more time, 1 inch, and press. We'll do the same thing for the second piece, and then we're going to stitch our hem in place. Our two backing pieces have been pressed and hemmed. Now we're going to take them and layer them together so that these finished hemmed edges overlap, and you want to place them together like this to create a 17.5 inch square. So I'm going to use my mat to help with that, and then we're going to pin these to hold these two layers in place. As you can see, we're going to then be able to put our pillow form in through this backing. Some people add Velcro in here or buttons. You can do that if you'd like, but it's not really necessary. Our pillow, when we're finished, is going to have binding on it. However, some people prefer to just sew their front and back right sides together. You could stitch a 1/2 inch around the perimeter and then turn it in right side out. We're going to add binding, so what we want to do is turn our backing wrong side up and then place our pillow top wrong sides together with our backing. Now we'll take and pin that together, and using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, we'll sew our pillow top to our backing. Our SewByNumber pillow top and the backing have been joined together, and as you can see, we now have an envelope where we can stuff our pillow form. Now the next thing we want to do is bind our pillow top. So we're going to need 80 inches of 3.5 inch strips. So you're going to need to join these strips together. We're going to place them perpendicular to one another, and then mark a line from corner to corner. And that's where we're going to sew, because once you flip it over, you can see you get a nice long straight piece of binding. By sewing our binding together like this instead of at right angles, we reduce the bulk and it gives our binding a much nicer appearance. So I'm going to mark that line first, and then I'm going to take it to the machine and sew right on that line. I've stitched my strips together, and now you can see when we flip it open, it's all nice and straight. To remove the bulk, we're going to take scissors and just trim about 1/4 inch from that seam and then press it open so it lies nice and flat. Our 80 inches of 3.5 inch strips for our binding have been sewn together. Now we're going to fold it in half, wrong sides together, and press. What I like to do, however, is start with my leading edge and fold that at a 45-degree angle and pressing that. This way, when you put your binding onto your pillow, when you bring your binding around to meet this edge, you have a nice finished folded edge in which to nest the other end of the binding. So we're going to start with that and then fold our binding in half, wrong sides together, and press. Our 80 inches of binding has all been pressed, wrong sides together, and now we're going to attach it to our pillow top. You have a choice of whether you want to attach it to the front side turn it around to the back, and hand or machine stitch it to the back side, or you can start with the back, attaching it to the back, bringing it around to the front, and top stitching it that way. I decided I'm going to actually top stitch mine on the front because I want a nice top stitched edge when I'm done. So you're going to start by taking your binding and placing it the wrong sides, the raw edges rather, of your binding with the raw edges of your pillow. You want to leave a tail good 6 inches because when we bring the binding back around to this side, we need a place to nest it. So we're going to start by pinning our binding to the back side. And we're going to miter our corners. So we're going to stitch this using a 1/2 inch seam allowance and stopping a 1/2 inch before we get to the corner. I'm going to sew my binding into place. As you can see, the raw edges are together. I'm leaving my tail about 6 inches open so that I can nest my binding on the other side as we come around. And I'm going to stitch using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then stop a 1/2 inch from the end so that we can miter our corner. I stopped stitching my binding a 1/2 inch from the corner. Now I'm going to take my binding strip and I'm going to turn it at a 45-degree angle so that the raw edge of the binding runs the same direction here as the pillow to create a mitered corner. I'm going to turn my binding back down, aligning the raw edges of the binding with the raw edge of the pillow top, and we'll pin that to hold it in place. Then we'll continue pinning our binding to the top along this edge, and again using a 1/2 inch seam allowance we're going to stitch our binding, stopping a 1/2 inch before we get to the corner. I've miter folded our corner, and then I'm going to start sewing right off the edge using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And what this will give us is a nice mitered corner when we fold it back around. Again, I'm going to stop a 1/2 inch before the corner and back tack. I've completed sewing the binding on 3 sides of my pillow and the 4 corners that are mitered. On this last side, I have these 2 loose tails. This is where I'm going to nest the end of the tail into the nice folded pressed beginning. The end of the tail is a little long, so I'll trim it so that the raw edge is nestled beyond the folded edges of the beginning of the binding. This will make our binding nice and smooth and flat with little bulk or bumps. I'll pin it in place and then finish stitching this last edge of binding in place. My binding is now completely sewn in place on the back side, so we're going to flip it over to the front side. I like to press my binding and pin it. So we'll do that. We'll press it in place because we're going to be top stitching it. So we'll start by along the edge here, and we'll press it and pin as we go. Now when we get to the corner, we're going to press this at a 45-degree angle so we can create a nice mitered corner on the front. So we'll pin right before that corner. And then we're going to take, we have this 45-degree angle here, we're going to take and fold that over and pin that in place. And I'll show you after I pin it here how you have a nice corner. See? So this will give you a really nice 45-degree angled corner when you stitch it down. So I'm going to continue pressing and pinning the four sides of the binding on the top of my pillow. I now have my binding pinned to the top side, and I have my nice corners pressed and mitered and pinned. So now I can top stitch around the entire front of my pillow. My binding is now completely sewn in place to the top side of my pillow cover. Now I can simply insert my pillow form, and I've completed my June Tailor Sew by Number pillow.